evening in West Monroe, Louisiana, where it's very dark and cloudy and rainy outside. My perfect kind of weather. So I don't know about you guys, but that's my favorite time. Not yours. You like it sunny and 75?
We're not raining today. We were raining yesterday.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's been overcast today, but that's my favorite kind of weather. But yeah, well, Doctor, and let me make sure that I get it right. Echeverria rhymes like Ave Maria. Okay, very good.
That's right.
I'm not always the best with pronunciation, so I apologize if I don't get it perfectly.
No problem.
Well, we're joined by Dr. Echeverria, Roman Catholic, and also Erick Ibarra, co-host, Roman Catholic. And it is great to have you. I've seen some of your material online that I was looking into, and it looks like you've done a little bit of work in the post-conciliar era. And that's, in fact, what we're going to be talking about today is Vatican II, the post-conciliar popes. Perhaps how does Pope Francis fare with other popes like John Paul II and Benedict XVI. So I'm very excited to hear your thoughts on this. But before I dive in with my first question, let me go ahead and introduce you formally. Dr. Echeverria is professor of philosophy and systematic theology in the Graduate School of Theology at Sacred Heart Major Seminary, the Archdiocesan Seminary of Detroit. He obtained his licentiate in sacred theology from the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Angelicum, in Rome, and he also received a doctorate in philosophy in Amsterdam. He's a noted scholar, speaker, and teacher in the USA and internationally, and has authored many articles. Do you have any books that you're working on currently?
Well, I'm the author of several books. I wrote a book on Divine Election, a Catholic orientation in dogmatic and ecumenical perspective in 2016. Before that, I'd written a book on the theology of the body, and on John Paul II's theology of the body. And before that, I'd written a book on dialogue of love, confessions of an evangelical Catholic ecumenist.
Yeah, I've seen that one on John Paul II around. I haven't had a chance to read it.
I wrote after my Divine Election book. Well, even before that, the first edition of my Pope Francis book, The Legacy of Vatican II. After the Divine Election book, I wrote a book. My granddaughter, who was 2.5, she died of meningitis, and so I wrote a book, In Oceans Deep, Redemptive Suffering in the Crucified God.
Okay.
And then I wrote another book, Revelation, History, and Truth, Hermeneutics of Dogma. That was published by Peter Lang early last year. And then just recently, the second edition, revised and expanded edition of my Pope Francis, The Legacy of Vatican II book. There it is right there.
Yeah.
And what are you really getting into in this book about Pope Francis?
Well, I mean, in the first edition, I tried to deal with Pope Francis in light of the Ignatian principle of charity. So I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt and sort of fill in the blanks. But this was already, this was published in 2015. So now, 6 years after, he became Pope, so 6 years into the pontificate, my position, at least on many things, has changed. I revised the book. I added some chapters. So I have a chapter on Amoris Laetitia, particularly.
Right.
I always say nobody would have cared about Amoris Laetitia but for chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia.
Right.
Because there the logic of pastoral reasoning is laid out. That's the problematic matter of the chapter. It's not that Francis denies. It's not that Francis. I have in that chapter I lay out, his. You got to search because it's not something that's prominently displayed. But I lay out his view of marriage, and in a basic respect, of course, he stands in the living tradition of the Church. He affirms the permanence of marriage. It's that the two-ness, male and female, and also that sexual differentiation is a fundamental prerequisite for the two to become one flesh. The problem is, of course, is the logic of pastoral reasoning collides with that, I think. And so then you don't have, there's the great, I would say, discontinuity in terms of, he insists, if you know, he insists he insists that you actually have to heed three principles for reading Amoris Laetitia. That you have to read the whole thing.
Yeah.
Okay. I always, you can read the whole thing and still disagree with chapter 8. That doesn't. I mean, yeah. Okay. Of course, let's read the whole thing.
Yeah.
Of course. But secondly, that it's he stresses that it's in continuity with the church, the tradition of the church. So there he emphasizes this aspect of continuity. And then thirdly, he says that his ethics in that chapter is Thomistic. I did the first seriously. I think the second and the third he doesn't, in my judgment, and I think I show that very clearly in the fourth chapter of my book, the second edition, that his ethics is not Thomistic, and nor is his teaching in continuity at the pastoral level. It's not in continuity with the church's teaching.
Yeah, it seems like St. John Paul.
Why it's not Thomistic. Thomas distinguishes between negative precepts, which are universally valid. They're always and everywhere valid. He distinguishes universal precepts and positive moral precepts, which I describe as precepts that have presumptive moral validity. So a presumptively valid moral precept would be, to take the example that Thomas gives, is that you suppose someone entrusts you with their property. And so the general precept is that someone entrusts you with their property, you're going to return it to him when he asks you.
Right.
Well, but suppose I'm going out with this, it's a bachelor party. I never go to bachelor parties, by the way, but a bachelor party. Actually, when I got married, I never even had a bachelor party. But you go to a bachelor party, and your friend, the bachelor, gets drunk, or at least has drank enough that you say to yourself, no, he's not going to drive home. So he had entrusted with his keys, and I say, Eric, I'm not going to give you your keys because you're not in a state of mind, having drunk so much, you're not in a state of mind to drive home. So that moral precept, which is presumptively valid, is not applicable in those circumstances. But that's distinct from a universally valid moral precept, a negative moral precept, as Thomas calls it, which is always and everywhere valid. Francis does not make that distinction, and hence the second question of the Dubia Cardinals. They were asking about whether, in the light of Amoris Laetitia, whether Veritatis Splendor, which affirmed moral absolutes are exceptionalist moral norms. Well, right. Francis, in my judgment, is trying to carve out an exception. He's trying to carve out an exception for the divorced and civilly remarried. And there are several aspects to that. One of them is that even though he says that he doesn't, he's not affirming, the distinction that John Paul II draws in paragraph 34 of Familiaris Consortio, he distinguishes between the law of gradualness, which everybody believes in. The law of gradualness, moral development is gradual. If you sin, of course, you go to confession, etc. But he distinguishes that, JP2 does, from the gradualness of the law. And so the gradualness of the law is the idea that moral precepts can be situation and person specific, and that you adhere to that precept, even if that precept is in fact not the full manifestation of the objective moral law. And so when Francis says in paragraph 303 that a person can act with moral certainty if he's given the best that he can act with moral certainty that what he's doing is right. In fact, that he says that this is the will of God, even though what he is doing in those circumstances is in fact, it contradicts the objective moral law. That seems to me, and I argue that throughout in that chapter, that seems to me to be affirming the gradualness of the law and not the law of gradualness. So you have it seems to me and so this opens the door, and other aspects of that is that it opens the door to people like Cardinal Supich arguing that homosexual couples, blah blah blah, cohabiting couples, etc., etc. They're doing the best that they can right now. This I always tell people, in the Bible, there's no such thing as doing the best you can is not a standard. Holiness is the standard, conforming to the objective demands of the law. So the last thing I want to say here, there's a lot to say, but the last thing I want to say is that Francis transforms the obliging force of the law into an aspiring force. So it becomes an ideal, you see, as opposed to having an obliging force here now, it has an aspiring force.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So this is totally out of line with the tradition. Totally out of line with John Paul II's Veritatis Splendor.
Right.
And totally out of line with Benedict, but certainly Veritatis Splendor. That's what the Dubia Cardinals were asking in question 2. Does this mean that that Veritatis Splendor, affirmation of moral absolutes, exceptionalist moral norms, intrinsically wrong acts, all of that is no longer valid?
So you would essentially say, though, that Francis is the one causing rupture, whereas popes prior to him, especially John Paul II, would not have caused this kind of rupture.
Certainly not on this matter. There's no reversal. We can go back to the beginning and talk about at least the way that Erick gave me the questions. But I think you can have development. Without change.
Yeah. And could you maybe speak to that? I mean, we also have seen, St. John Henry Newman just recently canonized. And of course, he's famous for his development of doctrine. Could you maybe speak to what is a legitimate development versus rupture or evolution?
Okay. Well, I think there are two different, not incompatible models of development, but I actually wrote recently an article for the Catholic thing, Newman on True and False Development. I don't know if you read the Catholic thing. Anyway, Newman on True and False Development. And I lay out Newman's 7 notes, really. They're not really criteria, they're notes. I say that they're necessary, but they're not sufficient conditions, because you need ecclesial warrants. That is to say, you need the scriptures, which has priority. You need the scriptures. You need the tradition of the church, which includes, of course, theologians faithful to the church. You need the magisterium. These are all going to be what my colleague, my friend Thomas Guarino calls ecclesial warrants, because you're going to have to decide, which developments are legitimate or not. But I just hold on a second. I just want to call this. So.
Yeah, your colleague there wrote a book on Saint Vincent of Lerins.
That's right, and I wrote a review of it for. It was posted on the Catholic. Yeah, let me come back to you. I wrote a review of that book. It was posted on Catholic World Report. But Newman, for instance, he distinguishes, I say, several tests. One of them is identity of type. So identity of type, I think, has to do with propositional truth. And that's how I would understand it. Propositional truth. Propositions and sentences are not the same thing. You can say the same thing. You can formulate the same truth differently. That's going to be crucial, huh? Identity of continuity of principle. Newman spends several chapters, discussing these things, but I wouldn't say that Guarino says at one point, after the essay, Newman actually never came back to those tests. But in any case, we've used them. The International Theological Commission in 1990 produced a document on the development of dogma, and in the concluding section of that document, it turns to Newman to illustrate what would doctrinal development look like. So Newman says identity of type, continuity of principle, the assimilative power of the dogmatic truth, logical coherence is another test, fecundity, the fruitfulness of the dogma, conservation and vitality. I say that in my article, I say, look, in particular, Newman says a true development is that which is conservative of its original, and a corruption is that which tends to its destruction. In fact, if you look at Vincent of Lorentz, remember, Erick knows this. I mean, when John the 23rd in his opening address to Vatican II, where he distinguishes between essentially the sacred dogmas of our faith and their formulation, and then has this subordinate clause according to the same meaning and the same judgment of truth. So, if you formulate the dogma in an alternative way, it has to keep the same meaning and the same judgment of truth. So the Vatican II there, John the 23rd, is referring us to Vatican I in the 4th chapter of Dei Filius, and Vatican I is actually citing Vincent of Lorentz from the Communitorium Primum, chapter 23. And Vincent, he asked the question, is there no progress in religion? And he distinguishes progress from change. Like Newman, change would be when one thing becomes something else. When one thing becomes something else. So for instance, I say, Newman affirmed the idea of propositional revelation. He called it the dogmatical principle. And he says that, for instance, the dogmatical principle would be, if we're talking about marriage, remember Jesus in Mark 10 and in Matthew 19, he's asked about divorce. He points us back to the creation text of Genesis 1:27 and 2:24. Here we have Newman's dogmatical principle at work. Male and female, he created them. And for this reason, a man will be joined to his wife, and the two, male and female, the two are male and female. That's why Genesis 1:27 will become one flesh, so that you have permanence, you have two-ness, male and female, and you have sexual differentiation being a fundamental prerequisite for the two becoming one flesh. So that we can deepen our understanding of marriage, we can grow in, but it would be change if we thought that we can now argue that two men or two women can be married. Because it's fundamental. What I use this term from Oliver Christ, a Reformed theologian who was teaching at Fuller Theological Seminary. Now he's an Englishman. He's back in Scotland, and what he calls a dogmatic conceptual hardcore. I think that's what when Newman talks about continuity of principle and identity of type, he's talking about a dogmatic conceptual hardcore. So a dogmatic conceptual hardcore is going to be permanence, two-ness, male and female, and crucially in our time, since our culture denies, Genesis 1:27, the ontology of male and female, that sexual differentiation is a fundamental prerequisite for to become one flesh, so that same-sex people cannot become one flesh.
Right.
So the idea that you could actually say that this is just development is not. It's a change. It's a change.
Okay. Well, let's talk about some of those changes, because I would say that Pope Francis has been in continuity with John Paul II in some changes which are not in continuity with the pre-conciliar church. For instance, the Assisi issue in 1986, Assisi 1. It seems like Pope John Paul II was saying that the meeting that took place in Assisi 1986 was the fruition of the Council of Vatican II. So could you maybe speak to that? Is Pope Francis in rupture with John Paul II when it comes to these issues?
I would say that doctrinally, Assisi does not change anything.
Mm-hmm.
Doctrinally, Assisi does not. I've written about that. I wrote an article which is integrated into the seventh chapter, or the sixth chapter of my Francis book on the dialogue of religion and the question of truth. Doctrinally, nothing changes. John Paul II gave an address to the Courier, where he discusses the sort of theological foundations of what was he trying to do at Assisi. Now, we can have all kinds of problems with Assisi. My position, I don't know if you've read Ratzinger's Truth and Tolerance. He has a chapter where he discusses multi-religious prayer, interreligious prayer, and he has problems with both of them. At Assisi, there was no interreligious prayer. They didn't pray together. Okay, they didn't pray together. So, as if to pray together would mean that assuming that we were all praying to the same God. No, they didn't pray together. So there was multi-religious prayer in the sense they went off into their respective corners. Now, again, if I was Pope, or if I had been, Ratzinger didn't approve of that when it happened. But it seems to me, those are practical prudential judgments. I don't accept using the phrase, as Erick does sometimes, the spirit of Assisi. That's no more valid than the spirit of Vatican II, because the spirit of Vatican II, yes, you can ask the question, what's the dynamic behind Vatican II? What was driving Vatican II? I would say two things were driving Vatican II. In the first place, ressourcement, back to the normative sources of the faith, a creative retrieval of those sources, so that we might move faithfully forward in the present, so that we might be able to address and answer the questions that are raised. We can never use aggiornamento, vulgarly translated as updating, as an isolated motive for renewal. No, it's going back to the authoritative sources of the faith. That's why ressourcement means back to the sources, back to the authoritative sources of the faith, so that we might go faithfully forward in proclaiming the gospel in the present. So we have to understand the present. It results in deepening our understanding. You can ask, well, what was the spirit of Assisi? Just as we can ask, what's the spirit of Vatican II? You remember in 1985, John Paul II called a synod on Vatican II, on the reception of Vatican II. And at the end of that synod, 6 principles were laid down for interpreting Vatican II documents. And one of those principles was that we can't separate the spirit from the letter of the text. Okay, so just as we can't separate, ressourcement and aggiornamento from the literal sense of the text, what are these documents actually saying? So too, if we talk about the spirit of Assisi, I think at the root of that would be, as St. Paul says, so far as is possible, live at peace with all men.
Here's my concern about Assisi. I understand what you're saying. There's no doctrinal changes there, but here's an implicit change that I would say does appear to be doctrinal. Of course, the Pope didn't actually say, hey, here's the doctrine, but here's the implicit change. To my knowledge, never did you have in the pre-conciliar church the popes asking individuals to pray to their pagan deities. Now, of course, he didn't say, hey, go and pray to your pagan gods. But what he did do is say, pray for peace, knowing perfectly well they're going to call on their pagan deities, and he gave them a platform to do that.
So I would say that I don't see that as a doctrinal change. I see that as a pastoral change, a practical change, because at Vatican II and leading up to Vatican II, I'll say more about that. You have to distinguish ecumenism from interreligious dialogue. Ecumenism is with fellow Christians. Ecumenism is not with Buddhists, Hindus, etc., Muslims. That's interreligious dialogue. I would say that, as we now say, the optics aren't good. But, I think he recognizes that. That's why he came out with, an address providing a theological foundation for that. Let me put it this way to you. When you read, for instance, the 1992 letter of peace of John Paul II, where he's trying to provide a justification for religious liberty, he's very careful. He's not saying that now we live in the fact is we live in a society, in a free society, and the free society is pluralistic. Okay, so error has no rights. Vatican II doesn't deny, it doesn't say that error has rights. But the fact is we live in a society where the subject, the agent who holds certain claims is free to say that. But that doesn't mean that what he's saying is true. It doesn't mean that what he's saying is that he's even justified in holding these things to be true. So that means that for us, and the Pope makes those distinctions, which is the distinctions that the Declaration on Religious Liberty makes. Everything that Leo XIII rejected about religious liberty in the 19th century, the Declaration on Religious Liberty also rejects. Just as everything that Pius XI in 1928, Mortalium Animus, rejected about ecumenism, the Decree on Ecumenism, 1965, and then John Paul II's 1995 encyclical Utunum Sit on Ecumenism, there's still this. There's a continuity there. There is a reversal. The reversal is that the church now affirms ecumenism. And at the heart of its ecclesiology is the question, the one church, the many churches, with a small c. So that the reversal does not occur with respect to the fundamental first principle of ecclesiology. That is, that the church that Christ founded subsists in its own right alone in the Catholic Church. There's no multiple subsistence ecclesiology. There's no, in other words, no ecclesiological relativism. Yes, the Church affirms that there are elements of truth and sanctification outside the visible boundary of the Church, and I can only agree that. I spent many years, I was raised Catholic, responded to the gospel in an evangelical Protestant context in 1970. Went through reform, evangelical Protestantism, the Reformed tradition, in particular Dutch Neo-Calvinism, Anglo-Catholicism, and then in 1992 I came back to the church. Or I normally say I went ahead into the church because I don't describe myself as a revert, because that suggests that everything that I learned in those 22 years was somehow just wasted time, and so I just sort of turned around. No. So there can be reversal without change in the fundamental dogma of the church. The Decree on Ecumenism and Utunum Sint affirms only one church, the Catholic Church. The church that Christ founded subsists in its own right alone in the Catholic Church. But it doesn't draw the conclusion that therefore outside the visible boundary of the church, all you have is a wasteland or emptiness. No. So we have to avoid drawing that conclusion, but we also have to then avoid the conclusion that many people wrongly drew, and that is that recognizing that there are elements of truth and sanctification outside the visible boundary of the church lead you to embrace ecclesial pluralism or relativism, a multiple subsistence ecclesiology, which is not the case.
Now, could you maybe clarify this for me? Because to me, it seems like it is an implied doctrinal change to say that God hears the prayers of pagans as they are praying to their pagan deities,
Well,
and respects them and blesses those prayers.
I go back to that's what I cite to my students. I go back to Pope Paul VI's 75 apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Nuntiandi. And he says there, I believe it's in paragraph 51, 52, he says, objectively now, the relationship between the church, those of us who pray to the triune God, there's an objective relationship there. Subjectively, those that are non-Christians, they may stretch their arms out there, but Paul VI says, but they don't reach the triune God. So that why don't they reach the triune God? Because objectively, of course, the mediator between God and man is Jesus Christ. It's not whatever religion you belong to. So again, the optics are not good. But I don't. There's never does John Paul II say, this multi-religious prayer. Ratzinger, I think, is more careful here, because he says even multi-religious prayer, even though we're not praying together, that can't be. He says that can't be we can't normalize that. We can't normalize that. We can't make that the usual way that we pray. Under certain circumstances, we have to be very cautious, he says, because in fact it creates the kind of impression of religious relativism, that is, that all religions are equally vehicles of salvation, that they're all equally true in some sense, and that God hears the prayers of all men. Now, under certain circumstances, a man who's struggling, and he calls out. I'm going to say that under certain circumstances, who does he call out to? If he calls out to some, pagan god, then of course I don't believe that quote unquote God is. There's idolatry. So
yeah. So would you say, and that's one of the issues that we've brought up here on the show, and I've written about it. After reading a lot of St. John Paul II, I kind of got the idea of where he was going, because he already anticipated what the readers and maybe a lot of what his colleagues were giving him warning of, that this could give way to indifferentism. So he seems to constantly try to tell, this is not pluralism, this is not indifferentism, this is not religious relativism.
Otherwise he wouldn't have written on the permanent validity of the church's missionary mandate, Redemptoris Missio, the mission of the Redeemer.
Yeah, the mission of the Redeemer. Yeah, so this is one of the issues, so I would say, and this is what I would go on the record saying, is that at the worst, St. John Paul II says that indifferentism is not effected, relativism is not effected, but what he decides to do and say anyway, really, it's almost like it's at the boundary of orthodoxy, and many people see it as leaning over, but the toes of the feet are still behind that line, because when we say, like in the Assisi meeting, there was a lot of backlash, and St. John Paul II knew about this. That's why in the Christmas address to the Curia, he kind of said, hey, this is the yellow tape here that we need to keep in mind, that this is not, I was not trying to create relativism.
No, because he doesn't accept religious diversity. He doesn't remember the problematic statement that Francis signed. That we don't know exactly what he meant, but whatever he meant, it wasn't true. That religious diversity is part of the will of God. John Paul II puts religious diversity, I argue, and he states, in the order of the fall. It's not from the order of creation.
Right.
And he raises something, and I argue in my chapter on the dialogue of religion, the question of truth. Both he and Ratzinger raised the question of truth, the question of justification, that at some point you have to say why you're a Christian. And if you're going to say why you're a Christian, if you're going to give reasons why you're a Christian and why you think that the Christian faith is true, that's going to lead you into arguing against, because you confirm and deny the same proposition. If Jesus Christ is the Word made flesh, if he's the fullness of God's revelation and so on, then of course it can't possibly be the case that you can be saved through whatever else other than Christ. So I think, my view is, look, these kinds of practical situations where the motive, it seems to me, is let's be at peace with all men. So as far as is possible, St. Paul says, let's be at peace with all men. Let's also try to promote the common good, matters of justice and so on and so on. I don't see any problem with that. I do have problems, when the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue sends letters to some of these religious leaders, wishing them whatever. We just, there's just the other day, a recent holiday or holy day, and I just think I read it, and I just think to myself, no. I mean, you can be friendly, you can promote interreligious dialogue, but interreligious dialogue always has to have the aim of justification and truth. Ratzinger says, yes, of course, there are these two conditions for interreligious dialogue, that you bring the full range of Christian commitments into the dialogue, and that you have to try to understand, Ratzinger says, the otherness of the other. But he says ultimately that's superficial, because at some point you have to provide a justification. In other words, you have to give reasons why you're a Christian. You have to get at the truth of the matter. So truth is always going to be the dynamic behind interreligious dialogue. In my view, and that's what I argue in that chapter, Dialogue, is that that's not the case in Francis. He never raises the question of justification and never raises the question of truth. And part of that, and who knows why he says this, but he says it. Part of that, I think, is, I say in the first chapter, he rejects what he calls abstract truth, which is really rejecting propositional truth. His understanding of the nature of faith is such that he doesn't think that faith has to do with, holding certain propositions to be true. He also rejects absolute truth, or he's skeptical. In an interview that he had with that octogenarian Scalafiri, Scalafiri asked him about this. Do you have to believe in absolute truth, and so on and so on, and he said, I'm skeptical about talking of absolute truth. And part of the reason is that he doesn't understand what it means to affirm absolute truth. I argue that he confuses the conditions under which I come to know that something is true with the conditions that make something true. And so he thinks if you affirm absolute truth, that means that it's not relational, that it's somehow independent, out there somewhere. And I say, no. I say, look, of course, it's not truth that it's relational. It's the knowledge of truth that's relational, that involves certain conditions under which ecclesial, historical, and so on, under which a person comes to know that something is true. But what makes something true is not dependent on me. That's the whole point of absolute truth, that P is going to be true even when it's widely denied, that the earth was round, that slavery was evil when even widely denied, that God exists. that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. The conditions under which I come to know these things is one question. The conditions that make it true is reality. So it has something to do with objective reality. Truth has to do with objective reality. The third thing is that Francis, one of his axioms from Evangelii Gaudium is that realities are greater than words.
Yeah.
And that raises all kinds of problems because realities, he's not talking about objective reality, he's talking about the historical, cultural circumstances, conditions. And then I ask, well, what about Nicaea? What about Chalcedon? What about the true status of those? I mean, are they just words? Is the Bible just giving us words? Isn't it making assertions, et cetera, et cetera? So when he comes to the question of the dialogue of religions, he says, and this is baffling, of course, but he says it several times. He says, of course, we have to enter the conversation with our commitments. The only thing we have to rid ourselves of is the idea that our beliefs are somehow unique and absolute, he says. Well, what does that mean? I mean, unique and absolute? Of course. You don't think that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us? Isn't that an absolute truth? Now, that doesn't mean that we can't go on to deepen our understanding of that truth. Throughout the centuries, theologians and so on have written about the incarnation, about the atoning work of Christ. But again, that has to, in a Linarian hermeneutics, that there has to be continuity in meaning and judgment. When Benedict gave that famous lecture in 2005 about the hermeneutics of Vatican II, he distinguished discontinuity and rupture, okay? But he didn't, the opposite of discontinuity and rupture was not mere continuity. That's where I think a lot of people go wrong. He said it was the hermeneutics of reform and renewal within continuity. So reform and renewal, the church reformed and renewed itself with respect to ecumenism. There was a reversal there. But there was no fundamental change in doctrine, because the church, ecumenism is not about, the diversity of churches somehow producing one church. No. Catholic ecumenism begins already with the affirmation that there is one church, the unity of the church. Credo in unam ecclesiam. There is already one church. And then in that context, it goes on to reflect about, ecclesial diversity within the one church. It's not a multiple subsistence ecclesiology. It's not ecclesiological relativism, but it's a hermeneutic. It's what I call a receptive ecumenism.
Right.
Ecumenism. That there's a receptive ecumenism means that ecumenism is not merely an exchange of ideas. It's an exchange of gifts. It's what the decree on ecumenism in paragraph 17, after making that distinction between truth and its formulations, keeping in mind, according to the same meaning and the same judgment, it then says it's not surprising if one tradition or another has a more apt appreciation of some aspect of the revealed mystery, deeper than us. We have a solemnity, for instance, of Christ the King. But in my judgment, the Reformed tradition, in particular, the Dutch Reformed theologian of the last century, Abraham Kuyper, has a 3-volume work on the Lordship of Christ. It's just been translated into English. Well, that is an instance of, I can receive that as a gift, not because the gift isn't that they're telling me something we don't know as Catholics. The gift is that they deepen my understanding of the Lordship of Christ. It's more articulate about the implications of Christ's Lordship, but as Vatican II said, it has to be complementary.
Right. Yeah, and I think everything you're saying here is music to my ears. I mean, I love the Dutch Reformed theologians. Herman Bavinck and
yes,
were fantastic. So when I have Reformed books on my bookshelf, and I don't look at that and say, oh well, he was a heretic or a schismatic.
Right.
But here's the thing, we all understand that the truth cannot deny that the church cannot deny truth wherever it is. But what I think seems to go wrong, and I think you agree with me, is when this comes into how to bring this out into a pastoral practice. Because, as you know, a lot of the Nouvelle Theology guys and a lot of the theologians just before Vatican II that were exploring this issue of people on the outside of the church, they would go to chapters like Acts 17, where Paul gets up on at the Areopagus or on Mars Hill, and his approach is different than when he was in the synagogue. When he's in the synagogue, he could talk about the Levitical rite, Melchizedek, symbolic bread. He could talk about these things with his fellow Jews. But when he goes to speak with the Gentiles, he has to sort of get out of his subdivision of categories into a broader framework, and he tries to touch base with them. Hey, you guys have an altar that has an inscription that says "To the unknown God," and even one of your own poets says,
right,
"We are all His." But what a lot of what these guys do, and I'm not mentioning any names here, but you know who I'm talking about, will take this and expand it as if now Paul is a precedent for pastorally engaging, allowing our the people who are supposed to hear the summons of the gospel, allowing them to come to the table and be a colleague and a cooperator in discussing truth. But if you read that sermon in Acts 17, and tell me if you agree with me or not, Dr. Ed, at the end of that sermon, Paul gives a very inflexible summons. He says, God will overlook your former ignorance, but now, that famous nuni, now he commands all men everywhere to repent, because he's fixed a day in which he will judge the world.
About it, I always say to people, look, when St. Paul comes on Mars Hill, he doesn't say, "Oh, I see you're all very religious, so I guess I can just go now. I don't have to be here." Of course not. But I think it would be a misuse of St. Paul. Here, let me tell you, I think one of the best books on this is by Jean Dallou, God in the Ways of Knowing. God in the Ways of Knowing. So it's an attempt to, one of the ways of knowing God. It's not the fullest way to know God, as the Catechism says, but they're trying to defend natural theology, so that you can have natural theological arguments, or even that there's a sense in which you can as it says in Romans 1, in Romans 1:18 and following, that God has made his existence, his eternal deity and power known to all men through the things that he has made. So through the things that he has made, and those things that he has made, including ourselves, that's going to be evidence, testimony for the existence of God. So that doesn't mean, and the point of that is, of course, is to show in Romans 1, is to show, St. Paul says, that having known God, they fail to honor him as God, and so men are without excuse. So this is holding men accountable. But I don't think, and we can't argue that out here fully. I mean, we'd have to look at text, but certainly God in the Ways of Knowing by Donnelly, for instance, is not trying. This is not trying to find a pastoral way to do what. Here's my view. I distinguish the Nouvelle Theologie of de Lubac and Congar and Donnelly and others from what I call neo-traditionalists, and also what they call themselves the new paradigm or the pastorality of doctrine approach.
Like a Cardinal Supage who would say that like he gave a lecture over in Oxford.
Yeah, I wrote all about it. He's totally out in the he doesn't know what he's talking about, to put it in plain words.
Newman. You see, he quoted Newman.
Yeah, but he didn't understand Newman. That was my argument. He doesn't understand Newman. He doesn't understand Vatican II on conscience.
Right.
He doesn't understand Newman. He doesn't understand Vatican II on conscience.
They stretch Newman out because, like St. Vincent of Lérins taught and St. John Henry Newman taught, they sometimes will use that analogy of the organic development of the human going from, a child to
going from from being in the womb. There's continuity of identity there. There's continuity of principle and so on.
Right, but sometimes what they'll do is they'll say they'll think to themselves that, well, when I was a child, like Paul says, when I was a child, I thought like a child, but when I became an adult, I put away childish things. So they kind of use that analogy in Paul, where you get what I'm saying.
This is so much. Honestly, I'm not saying you're saying nonsense, but if you're describing their view, if that's their view, this is so much nonsense, okay? Because why would see, that's again the difference between the law of gradualness and the gradualness of the law. The law of gradualness, of course, there's moral developments as we, as we grow as human beings morally. We fall, we sin, but then St. Paul says, of course, obviously, that do not be deceived, that if you live a certain way and if you make certain choices, that causes exclusion from the kingdom of God. In the first letter of John, in the first chapter, in the 9th verse, if you confess your sins, he is faithful and just, forgive you your sins and to cleanse you from all unrighteousness. So all of that is consistent with recognizing men's weaknesses, etc. But we can't make, John Paul II says, paragraphs 102, 103, 104 of Veritas, we can't make our weakness the standard. No, of course, the church attends to weakness, doesn't want to crush a bruised reed and so on and so on. But that's very different than saying, the moral law, the gradualness of the moral law is such that in a specific situation, you're doing the best that you can. And if you're doing the best that you can, then that's right for you at that time. That's Supage's position. In fact, I quote him explicitly. He says, even if what you're doing is a great distance from the objective moral law. Well, Newman would never have bought into that. That's just nonsense. That's a total misunderstanding of Newman's notion of conscience, and certainly a total misunderstanding of Vatican II's notion of conscience. Let me add this point. The pastorality of doctrine approach, I distinguish that from the neo-traditionalists. The neo-traditionalist, it seems to me, does not acknowledge that theological modernism had actually identified a real problem in upholding the permanence and meaning of truth. So the neo-traditionalist absolutizes continuity of dogmatic truth without displaying, I say, any appreciation for the historical nature of the way that those truths have been formulated. And so has also no appreciation for reversal. I've just been reading Bishop Schneider's book. You all know that book.
Yep, just came out.
Vincent and so on. And I like the book, but when he talks about Vatican II, the one thing that Bishop Schneider cannot deal with is reversal. Because he thinks reversal, he thinks that whenever you have what he sees as change, which I think is a reversal, that he thinks that the council was pastoral, and so that because the council is pastoral, therefore, when there is any change, what he perceives as change, like ecumenism, that therefore we don't need to accept that. And so the only criteria he has is continuity. But continuity is not enough. continuity is not enough. We have to attend to reform and renewal in the church.
Yeah, I think that we do cut a hole in the ground underneath our feet when we deny reversal. Like, for example, even though the church fathers didn't think it was reversal when they dogmatized that images of our Lord, images of Our Lady, and the saints deserve a certain kind of veneration, there had been large sections of the church in the early centuries that never bought into that, and they thought it was never safe to do that. In other words,
well, like iconoclasts. I mean, I know.
Yeah, but even in like Tertullian or Origen or Saint Justin the Martyr, Athenagoras, you see them talk about how we don't use candles because the pagans use candles because they think that candles are going to get them favor with God. So they have this meaning that they put to things, and they don't allow these things. They wouldn't allow pictures in the place of divine worship, But later on, as time went on, the church learned how to give a different meaning to candles.
That's Newman's assimilative power of dogmatic truth.
Right.
In chapter 6, he talks about the assimilative power.
Right. But what I think, and I think we could also come up with a good parallel for this with the understanding of penance, because, going from public penance once in a lifetime to private confession to having it many times, and then the order of penance, these things, I mean, a lot of the traditionalists, it's almost like they think that back in the 3rd century, people were going to confession every Saturday morning. Well,
that's why I always quote here, Yaroslav Pelikan says, he describes the position that I'm calling neo-traditional. Tradition without history has homogenized all the stages of development into one statically defined truth, huh?
Right, and that's historically, that's historically dishonest,
Let's see. Let's not call them dishonest. They don't seem to understand. So they think that there's only one way to say something.
Right.
So that's why, for instance, they think that Pius XI of his 1928 encyclical on ecumenism, Mortalium Animus, is normative. That's the normative teaching of the church on ecumenism, and hence they reject unitatis redintegratio, they reject ut unum sint. Let me add this, because there's another way, which is what I was calling the pastorality of doctrine approach. And this approach, I think, is historicist. They fixate on the historical factual process. They reject the idea that truth, it transcends the historical context. They reject propositional truth.
Right.
They reject propositional revelation. And one theologian in particular, Christoph Theobald, the Jesuit, he collapses the distinction between the substance of the deposit of the faith and its formulations into an historical context. So he rejects the Linarian subordinate clause of,
same meaning.
According to the same meaning, the same judgment. And he dismissed the notion that unchanging truths and their formulations are distinguishable within the deposit of faith. And so his approach, it's a kind of a perpetual hermeneutics, a perpetual interpretation, perpetually reinterpreting and recontextualizing the faith.
Yeah, it's always, and this kind of goes back to some of my experience in the past with this, talking with, and I don't mean to insult presuppositionalists here, but sometimes in the some of the critiques that presuppositionalists have towards the classical method, classical evidential method of deduction and things like this, it's almost as if they can't seem to get the idea that there is truth that exists aside from our apprehension of it. It's almost like those two things can never be put into an isolated form of scrutiny. They always have to be together. And so it's always about how the human psyche perceives something. Right. Right. But we're getting closer to the end here. But I just want to say that I all the on a theoretical level here, I think that you've put this down very well. I think the whole issue does become a bit of a conflict for me, and I don't really see a preservation of type or anything like that when St. John Paul II, not only did he allow, but he defended it, giving people certain space to do whatever it is that their religion does. That I think that any Christian in the last 2,000 years, no matter how much development you have, no matter how much nuance there is, no matter how much progression there is in thought and idea, I don't think they would have ever come to the idea that it would be an okay thing to tell a Shintoist, a Hindu, a Muslim to set up their equipment, get their clothes on, put blankets on, and dance around and do their thing. And that's where it becomes a matter of, maybe you deny the validity of those things, but
I can't deny. Look, the fact is that okay, so you go back to Nostra Aetate, and Nostra Aetate says that the church does not deny, whatever is good or true there. Okay, so I don't think the church has the view that those religions are just entirely false. Now, of course, just like Plato and Aristotle, it's an entirely false framework, and yet we read Plato and Aristotle because they affirm certain things that are true. Okay, just one thing here, and that is that Ratzinger, Benedict really, says in one of his last addresses, he speaks about Nostra Aetate. Let me just read that before we end. But
yeah, go ahead.
He says. This is on the 50th anniversary of the opening of Vatican II, regarding the reception of Nostra Aetate. He says, in the process of active reception of Nostra Aetate, a weakness in this otherwise extraordinary text has gradually emerged. It speaks of religion solely in a positive way, and it disregards the sick and distorted forms of religion, which from the historical and theological viewpoints are of far-reaching importance. For this reason, the Christian faith from the outset adopted a critical stance towards religion, both internally and externally. So again, the point is that you can find all kinds of people that all they do is accentuate the positive. I think that that's right. That what Ratzinger said here, that's one of the weaknesses of Nostra Aetate, is that it doesn't actually bring out in its effort to be positive. It doesn't bring out the sick and distorted forms of religion. It doesn't bring out what is false. However, of course, the church, even though it doesn't deny that there are elements of truth there in those religions, of course, when they affirm certain things that are incompatible with Christian truth claims, as a Catholic, one says that they're false. Those things are false. That should be the whole point. This is something that Francis never says, as I say in the book. I mean, there's nowhere where he raises the question of justification, the question of truth, and for that matter, even the question of evangelization. He's never really made clear what's the difference between evangelizing and proselytizing. Most recently, he sort of suggested that there was some kind of difference, but remember, you remember that when he came the last trip in Africa, this sister, this nun, brought up two people who came into full communion with the Catholic Church, and rather than responding in a positive way, he I would say he sort of insulted this this sister. Right. As if she was bringing these two people up as if they were prizes and this sort of thing. So I can't imagine how this sister felt after being dealt with in this way by the Holy Father.
Yeah, that's. I think
just one last thing.
Yeah,
that is whatever we find that we don't agree with, I don't agree with, there are certain practices, choices that John Paul II made that I don't agree with, that I think are confusing and so on. But you know what I have that I don't have with Francis? And that is I have an extensive body of literature, of writings, and in light of which I can then make sense of what his views really are. And
Right.
and this circumstance is kind of like an anomaly. He took a chance.
Yeah,
But-
I noticed that because when I read St. John Paul II, you can't deny he was a theological genius, you know, and he knows how to carve out what he's saying, and he knows how to put the Eastern tradition together with a full theological synthesis with Catholic theology, and it's really great. But I just can't get around it. You know, we get it all the time, whether it's from our Eastern Orthodox friends or Protestants, where all they have to do is it doesn't matter how many titles from St. John Paul II you put down for them to read. They have a YouTube link where he's there with his hands behind his back, and an Indian person with a bandana is doing this and that with rattles and shaking this, and he's just sitting there and he's taking it.
You know, but the fact that the Pope would, whenever he landed in a country, he would kiss the ground doesn't mean that he thought that the ground was somehow God. I mean, that's what he did because he wanted to respect the country he was coming to. If you were to ask him, you know, why did he kiss the Quran? I mean, maybe that was, I don't know, but maybe that was kind of like somebody pushing it on him. And what was he going to do? Slap it away, slap the guy's hand away and say, I'm not kissing this thing. Yeah. I don't know. But you know what? What I do know is that the Pope was not a religious relativist. He didn't think that all religions were equally vehicles of salvation, that they were all equally true.
Right.
He was. So I go back to his writings. When those anomalies arise, you see, I go back to the substantial, even before 1960, Love and Responsibility. And then when he came back from Vatican II, you know, sources of renewal, the implementation of the Second Vatican Council, and then the acting person, you know, his philosophical texts on anthropology and you know, person and community essays. I mean, there's, and then how many encyclicals, apostolic exhortations, apostolic letters, and so on. That's what I want to, you know, we are going through a time in the church now where there's amnesia. Francis, it seems to me, whatever crisis we have in the church now, ecclesially, morally, doctrinally, I don't think you can pin it on John Paul II or Benedict or Vatican II for that matter. That's what I argue in my first. I don't believe that Francis, in my reevaluation, I don't believe that Francis understands the legacy of Vatican II.
Doctor, is it okay if we go to some questions?
Sure, please.
Looks like this one is from Mr. Dalmatia, I guess is how you say it. He asks about the third secret of Fatima and the great apostasy. What do you think about those things?
You know, honestly, I don't know anything about those things.
Okay, fair enough. There's another one from CS that says, what do you think of dual covenant theology? It appears that Benedict XVI propagated this.
I don't think that's true. Dual covenant theology means that the church and Israel are on two tracks, and that you can be saved as a Jew and saved as a Christian. No, I think the church, if you go back and you read the last document it's not the Pontifical Council of Promotion of Christian Unity, but look, the Jews belong in a separate category, as it were. It's not, they're not even in the interreligious dialogue category, because of course, Israel, Judaism is the Old Testament revelation and so on. But in that document, irrevocable gifts, it explicitly rejects a dual covenant theology. Now, Ratzinger, I don't think he accepts a dual covenant theology. I mean, I think he thinks that we can deepen our understanding of the Old Testament, and that if we look at Jewish theologians and so on, we can deepen our understanding. But he doesn't think that you're saved you can be saved as a Jew. That you would find that more in someone like Casper. And even a few years ago, well, more than a few years ago, there was this subcommittee in the American Bishops' Conference, where they came out with some nonsense about that, and Cardinal Dulles and even Bob Fastigi and what's her name, Rosalind Moss. They wrote letters and articles about how that's just not true, and in fact, of course, Cardinal Dulles was accused by the members of this committee of being a fundamentalist and reading, not treating the scriptures the way the Catholics do, and so on. But no, I think you have to think very carefully about this. But the fact is, what is the place of Israel within God's plan of salvation? Romans 9-11 makes it clear. It's not, you can't go around Christ. It's through Christ. The church rejects a dual covenant theology. That's all I can say. If she wants to, if CS, whoever CS is, yeah, she can, or he or she can go look at that document on irrevocable gift. It's quoting from St. Paul's letter to the Romans in the 9th chapter, that the gifts that God gave Israel he doesn't sort of revoke them. Right. So it's a rejection of a hard sort of supersessionism. Right. But all Christians have to be supersessionists in some sense. Jesus is the Messiah of Israel, the fulfillment of Old Testament promises, the Word made flesh, salvation. Christ is the power of God to salvation for the Jew first and for the Greek. So, I mean, it's just, there's no such thing as I know people affirm this, but the church does not affirm a dual covenant theology.
Sure. Same individual asks, how many popes does it take to create a tradition? The last 3 popes opposed the death penalty, but all the prior were fine with it.
Okay, so this raises questions about the status of the teaching. I mean, personally, I don't agree with Francis's rejection of capital punishment. Both John Paul II and Benedict never said capital punishment was intrinsically wrong. There was a loophole. I mean, there was definitely a change, because they didn't try to justify capital punishment with respect to retributive justice. It was more what C.S. Lewis called the humanitarian theory of punishment, rehabilitation, and all this kind of thing. And then in the end, of course, if you had a penal system that was able to keep somebody in jail, free, protecting them or isolating them from society, and if you didn't, then of course you were going to be free to administer capital punishment. John Paul II and Benedict never denied that under certain conditions you can actually administer capital punishment. Why? Because they knew that the church had never said in its long tradition that capital punishment was intrinsically wrong. The question is, what's the status of the teaching? That's the difference. If you follow that conversation with Bob Fastigi and Edward Fazer, Fazer thinks that the teaching is infallible, whether primary or secondary level infallibility, whereas Bob Fastigi thinks that it's not infallible, and so it can change. But even if it's not infallible, even if it's a reversible teaching, it can't simply, the reasons that Francis gives for changing it, it seems to me, are don't hold any water. I don't think they're justified. And in fact, at one point he comes so close to saying, in fact, he says that capital punishment is inconsistent with the logic of the gospel. Well, if it's inconsistent with the logic of the gospel, that suggests that somehow it's inherently wrong.
Right.
But he never actually says that, because he knows if he said that, he'd have to say, well, the tradition has been wrong for so many thousands of years. So it's all, I don't think that will stand. Look, the fact is, I'm reading now a new book by Cardinal Muller, Roman Encounters on the unity of the faith and the responsibility of the Pope to maintain the universal church. Every time I read Cardinal Muller, I wrote a review of his book, The Power of Truth, for Catholic World Report. I'm just astonished that he was always bending over backwards trying to, provide some justification for Francis. Francis got rid of him. I'm baffled.
The next one is from James. He says, is Vatican II's decree on religious liberty binding, and are the SXPX wrong in your view for rejecting this?
Well, again, that's a long conversation, but there is a reversal between Leo and Vatican II, the declaration, but there isn't a change in doctrine. The church doesn't say, when accepting religious liberty, that you're free to make whatever you choose right. No, remember I said earlier, we live in a free society. We have to give an account. We have to deal with religious pluralism. Okay, so in the context of religious pluralism, a man can be free to hold X. That doesn't mean that he's justified in holding X. Legally, he's free to hold X, but in terms of in terms of justification, that doesn't mean that he's justified in holding X, and it certainly doesn't mean that X is true. So that means that the way we deal with opposing views in our culture is going to have to be, this is the new Christendom, the sanctified laity. It's going to be, engaging in interreligious apologetics. It's going to be engaging in critique and the kind of things that that Robert George does and many others do. I mean, you're going to have to try to persuade people that the beliefs that they hold that they're not justified in holding this to be true, and furthermore, that what they hold to be true is false. So religious liberty doesn't commit you to a kind of a subjectivist theory of knowledge or a subjectivist view of truth, where the church is not denying in the Declaration of Religious Liberty everything that Leo rejected about religious liberty. The Declaration on Religious Liberty still rejects subjectivism, a subjectivist epistemology, a subjectivist view of truth. The idea that somehow, the church can't proclaim the gospel, and so the gospel becomes a totally private matter. Remember, what's his name? William James said that religion is something that you do in solitude. Well, of course, the Declaration of Religious Liberty rejects all of that. There's a reversal, but there isn't a fundamental change in doctrine regarding Christian anthropology, justification, truth. There's still only one true religion. It doesn't mean, when you affirm religious liberty, that doesn't mean that you think there are now many. It doesn't mean that you're committed to religious relativism. So we have to, Vatican II doesn't think these things through. It simply asserts that there is an underlying continuity there, even when there is a reversal. So you have to, it left it up to its theologians, to those that are faithful to the mind of the church to work out. There's a surface contradiction, but not a real contradiction in the end. Just as there's a surface contradiction between Mortalium Animus of 1928 and the Decree on Ecumenism, but there isn't a real contradiction. There is reform and renewal in the continuity of the one subject church, as Benedict says. But you have to work at it. Mm-hmm. You have to work at it. You can't just assume that it's. They didn't work it out for you. These weren't dogmatic treatises. Right. They were documents, however beautiful and difficult they can be to read. This is why I reject the idea that they actually were intentionally trying to be contradictory, and to me that's just those are just cheap shots, and it doesn't do the work that the church has entrusted to its faithful theologians and philosophers and so on to show that there's reform and renewal there in continuity, even when we have reversal. Remember, religious liberty it's not a first or secondary, it's not a dogma, and it's not even a doctrine. And dogmas, and all dogmas are doctrines, but not all doctrines are dogmas, huh? But in the first and second levels, you can have infallible teaching. What does it mean for a teaching to be infallible? It means that it has the highest degree of certainty. The church ascribes the highest degree of certainty to these things. The church doesn't make it truth. The church doesn't create truth. So we have to consider reversal. That's why I come back to, I like him, Bishop Athanasius Schneider. He doesn't know how to deal with reversal. He can't deal with reversal, it seems to me. And you have to be able to deal with reversal and show that there can be reversal without change. You can have development without change. The church did not change its fundamental ecclesiology when it was committed to ecumenism. It did not embrace a multiple subsistence ecclesiology, which is just another way of saying ecclesiological relativism or pluralism. As Ratzinger said in his, in his theological highlights of Vatican II, he says, the church found a way to commit itself to ecumenism within the logic of Catholicism, within the logic of the first principle of Catholic ecclesiology, that the church that Christ founded subsists in its own right alone, nowhere else, subsists in its own right alone in the Catholic Church. I recently was in Biola University, Talbot Theological Seminary, to speak on these matters.
Looks like there's another one. It says the Council of Florence says the Jews are reprobate. Vatican II says the Jews are not reprobate. How do you reconcile that?
Well, again, I think you have to ask yourself, what is the status of the teaching? What is the theological note qualifying that teaching? When it talks about, I'd have to look at the specific phraseology there, but I'll take his word for it, or her word for it, that says the Jews are reprobates, huh? But that's not infallible teaching. Not everything that the church has asserted throughout the ages is infallible. That doesn't mean that the church now thinks that the church now embraces a two-covenant theology. It does not embrace a two-covenant theology. The concentration point of the history of redemption is Jesus Christ, who is the fullness and mediator of all revelation. There's only one way to be saved. You can only come to salvation through Jesus Christ. The church still teaches that, has always taught. Vatican II doesn't reverse. You can't reverse that teaching. That's an infallible dogma of the church. And so, however we go on to think about, we have to think about the question, what's the place of Israel within God's plan of salvation? A plan of salvation that's centered in Christ. Well, if you read 9 to 11 of Romans, St. Paul doesn't tell us that their place is around Christ. It's not 2 tracks or anything like that. So it's always important then to look at what's the status of the teaching. Just as I said with respect to capital punishment, what's the status of that teaching? There is controversy over that. Many years ago, the late Justice Scalia in First Things had an exchange, with Cardinal Dulles and so on, and he took that teaching to be infallible teaching, and he could hardly believe that anybody was saying now that teaching could be changed. So you got to look at what's the status of the teaching. So we'd have to go back and look at the Council of Florence to see what's the status of that teaching. Has the church changed its view on that? Well, even if it's changed its view, that doesn't mean that it now thinks you can be saved as a Jew. It now affirms a two-covenant theology.
Can I say something to that question?
Please.
I don't know if Mike.
No, that's it for the question. So if you want to go ahead and do that.
I just want to say that there's a lot of things that never got developed in the early centuries and in the councils all the way up to even the time of Florence. And this question about Jews being reprobate before the Council of Vatican II, and now they're not. It's a question. It's a deeper question along the level of somebody's standing before God, and the one pope who really opened up the door, and he didn't open up the door intellectually for the first time. He opened up the door magisterially for the first time, is Pope Pius IX in 1864. So a lot of our viewers there in the YouTube chat, they got to rewind. Okay, we're not talking about the 1960s here. We're going back way before that, where Pope Pius IX, in an allocution and in an encyclical, he comments and says that it's possible for certain people who labor in invincible ignorance.
Right, exactly, invincible ignorance. Yeah.
Right. So, but this is not like something that Pope Pius IX picked up out of nowhere, because we already have in the New Testament itself. For example, Cornelius, right? Cornelius,
Right.
Right. I think he was a centurion, right? He was
right.
Well, here's an unbaptized man. He's not a Jew, and yet his prayers are heard. That doesn't mean that God knew about the prayers. Okay, when Luke says he heard the prayer of Cornelius, it meant that God welcomed that prayer. And then he said that God was pleased with his almsgiving.
Right.
Well, here's a man who's not been included explicitly into the Paschal mystery.
Mm-hmm.
He's not been sanctified by Jewish ritual. Okay, so he's at best a God-fearer. Okay.
Right.
But here God is working outside the fixed normative framework.
Mm-hmm.
And he's hearing prayers and accepting good works on certain conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, that's right. So you have to, this is what, it's another discussion, but Lumen Gentium 16, the fate of the unevangelized. In particular, in Lumen Gentium 16, in those 3 paragraphs, Lumen Gentium 13 states that God calls all men to be saved. Lumen Gentium 14 talks about those having distinguished between those that belong to the people of God from those that are in one fashion or another related to the people of God but don't belong. It talks about, in Lumen Gentium 14, it talks about Catholics. In Lumen Gentium 15, it talks about our separated brethren. And then it comes in Lumen Gentium 16 to talk about Jews, Muslims, and others. And they're very specific. Ralph Martin wrote about this in his book, Will Many Be Saved? It's a great book, it seems to me. I've written about it also in other places, defending Ralph against Father O'Connell and others whose view they have a kind of a universalist view. Vatican II does not subscribe to universalism.
Right, and another example of that would be the man that Jesus came across who had pleaded to the Lord for his daughter. I think it was his daughter, right. His servant to be
his healed. Servant. Yes, his servant to be healed. Right.
And Jesus turns around, and Jesus was a conservative. I mean, when we talk about
he was a Jew.
He was a Jew. He was very conservative. There was the woman who I think it was her daughter was sick, was begging, and he gave the analogy that she used the analogy that even the dogs eat the crumbs off the
right.
The homeowner's table.
He was. This is the kind of this. I would say this is analogous to the sinner's prayer. The man who gets on his knees. He may not know Christ, but he's with outstretched arms. He's asking right. To be heard, and so on.
Right.
So, it seems to me that there's a way to think about these things without surrendering to a kind of a
right
religious pluralism or universalism or anything like
right
that.
Yeah, and like I was saying, the Lord said this man had more faith than anyone in the house of Israel.
Right.
Now what I think, like what you just said, there's a way to think about these things. Here's where I think people have gone wrong. We don't need to call names out, but we all know who they are. Is when it comes to the brass tacks. When I'm standing in front of you, when I'm going out and sharing the gospel, when I'm on television in front of billions of people, and I tell them, hey, it's possible that you can get up the mountain of the Lord through conscience, through Hinduism, Christ is working in the background. It's not Hinduism saving you, but it's Christ in the background. When you go on stage and say this in front of millions of people, you write it in your books. This is the problem. When it comes to brass tacks, we need to present the inflexible, clear summons,
the unshakable truth.
The unshakable truth. We can talk about the exceptions post de facto. we could talk about the extraneous or the extenuating circumstances afterwards. You know,
why go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, but when it comes, what I think we need to return to is the bold-faced ambassador motif that Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 5, where he says, "We, knowing the terror of the Lord, we persuade men. We implore you as ambassadors, be reconciled to God. The day of salvation's here." If you lose that,
I agree 100% with you, and I think if we look at John Paul II, I think that's there in his. It's certainly there in his writings, and it's certainly there in Benedict's writings, and so this is what I call. I argue against any kind of inclusivism, whether it's broad or narrow, and certainly not a inclusivist pluralism. I think the church defends a kind of an accessibilism, which says that under very specific conditions, obviously, if you distinguish the question, can a man be saved apart from the works of Christ? The church says no. Can a man be saved apart from actually explicitly responding to Christ and to the works of Christ? Well, the church says, possibly. But then but that's not going to be because these religions are vehicles of salvation. Vatican II never says that these religions are vehicles of salvation. It affirms a kind of an accessibilism, which says, in principle, it's possible. It's possible. But if a man is in, and then there are all these conditions of that deal with invincible ignorance, that a man, for instance, has to have this sincere search for God, which what I always cite there is what it says in Hebrews 11 verse 6, where it says, "But without faith it is impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him." Who diligently seek him. That's one of the conditions that Lumen Gentium 16 lays out. That the man is also invincibly ignorant. That's a condition, of course, that's ultimately that's in the hands of God, who's invincibly ignorant or not. But also that without grace, it's grace. A person may be judged on the basis of the natural law, on the basis of his conscience, because the natural law presses down upon the conscience of man. But it explicitly says there in Lumen Gentium 16 that there's the impulse of grace there, where the church is not affirming a kind of a Pelagianism, as if you're going to be saved through works. But also, the important thing is that it's the sheer possibility. It's not probable, and it's certainly not certain. I remember Ralph Martin in his book "Will Many Be Saved?" He says, in our culture, we've gone from possibility to probability to certainty, and so we've promoted a culture of universalism. This is why. I think that's one of the reasons we dispensed with, that affected the sacrament of confession, that affected even our understanding of funeral masses. What is a funeral? That people don't think they have to pray for the dead any longer. It's as if somehow it's all well and good. It's whatever. You assume that the man is in the company of the Lord. Yes, of course. The priest, I always say, you don't want to sound like a skeptic, Father. You have to give people hope. The hope of the resurrection. In all of the Eucharistic prayers, it distinguishes between those who have died in the hope of the resurrection, and those who have died under the mercy of God. So, and those who have died in the hope of the resurrection, and then those whose faith is known to you alone. So I'm going to entrust the person who dies I'm going to entrust him in God's hands. I'm going to pray, for God's mercy unless, of course, I know that this person actually, died in the hope of the resurrection. You don't know that often. But even then, you still want to pray for this man. You can't assume that he's in the company of the Lord. You have to give people a sense of hope, but that hope is grounded in the resurrection of Christ, in the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. But there are, as I say, there are all these conditions. But with those matters, we're dealing with exceptions. Jesus doesn't say, "Well, go out and figure out who is invincibly ignorant." No. We're there to proclaim the gospel, Matthew 28 or Mark 16, or as you quoted, from St. Paul from 2 Corinthians 5, that we're ambassadors of, what is the message? The message is that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, not counting men's sin against them. And so the message is, he says, be reconciled to God, not be reconciled to God according to what is possible for you. That's the other problem of with Amoris Laetitia chapter 8, is that it seems as if be reconciled to God within the limits of your situation, according to what is possible. John Paul II says, also again in Veritatis Splendor, which is never actually quoted, mentioned, footnoted in the entire apostolic exhortation, but he says, it's what is possible for you as a redeemed person. The power of the resurrection is at work in your life. You have to, be open to that, and so on, so that you don't think that you don't make your own weakness the standard. You don't make your own weakness the standard, as the Pope, John Paul says.
Dr. Echeverria, I'd love to have you on again. This was truly a pleasure. There's quite a few other questions I'd like to ask, so maybe off the air, if you're willing to come on, I'd love to do this again.
Every time you want me to come on, I'll be happy.
Okay. We'll hash out some dates and off the air, probably in about a month or so, if that works.
That's fine.
But yeah, I'll shoot some your way.
Right.
Now, I don't for sure know exactly where to point individuals to for your material. I know there's the Catholic thing, but did you have any other plugs?
My articles, sort of popular 1,000 word or so. You go to the Catholic thing, or you go to the Catholic World Report. If you want a more sort of academic articles, you can go to I'm on academia.edu.
Okay.
Academia.edu. Academia.edu. I have a whole pile of articles there. And of course, my books. All you have to do is go to Amazon and type in my name.
Yeah, this is the book.
Awesome.
And Pope Francis, if they want to know what I think about Pope Francis after, this is the second edition, revised and expanded. I threw out a couple of chapters. I revised the first chapter. I gave, in the preface, I give a justification for why I can, sometimes people say, oh, you've bought into this hermeneutics of suspicion regarding Francis or distrust. No, I argue that it's legitimate, both theologically, canonically, and certainly biblically, to raise questions of the papacy, even while remaining, faithful, to the papacy for the good of the church, and so on. And then I have this chapter. The first chapter is on Pope Francis and the legacy of Vatican II. And then I have a chapter on his soteriology, which is revised from the first edition. It's somewhat more critical. And then I have a chapter on Christ, the fulfillment of the law. I mean, in my view, Francis has never, ever given account of what's the place of the moral law in the life of the Christian, And so some parts of it are the same from the first edition, but I'm very critical of that. How can you not? After almost 6 years, he's talked about the commandments. The Catechism of the Catholic Church has, in part 3, has like 500 paragraphs on the commandments. How can you not talk about the commandments? Even in that little exhortation on holiness, it's all about the Beatitudes, but not about the commandments, even though he has a sentence where he says that the commandments provide a framework for the moral life, but he never goes on to talk about that. And then I have a chapter on Amoris Laetitia, which focuses on chapter 8, which I think is problematic. And then a chapter on Evangelium Vitae. Francis has never outrun his statement that he made in this first book, this first interview book that he had with the Jesuits, where he minimized morality, moral precepts, talking about them as secondary, and then criticizing those people who were obsessed with this, that, or the other. So I talk about that. How do you get an integral perspective of the moral life in the gospel? And then the chapter on ecumenism, and then the chapter on dialogue of religions and the question of truth. And the last chapter, all of these are new. The last chapter is on crisis of the church. The crisis is ecclesial. Synodality to me is can be turned into, and has been turned into, a kind of a local option Catholicism, as George Weigel puts it. It's moral, and it's also doctrinal. There's a kind of deconfessionalization that the church is undergoing. That you never ever would have found in John Paul II or Benedict.
Okay.
Never ever.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this, everybody. You heard it here. Dr. Edward Echeverria, Pope Francis, The Legacy of Vatican II, available on Amazon.com. And in fact, I'm going to put a link to it at the description.
All of my books are available on Amazon.com.
Everything on Amazon. And then there's the Academia.
If you're interested in divine election,
yeah.
If you're interested if you want to know about suffering, as a Christian, if you want to know about theology of the body, as I say, I have a book on John Paul II's theology of the body, and then my book on my engagement with Dutch neo-Calvinism, Dialogue of Love, Confessions of an Evangelical Catholic Ecumenist.
Good, and I'm also going to put a link to the Academia.
Academia.edu. Yeah. Exactly. You can find all kinds of articles that I've written. They're more academic, whereas the other ones on the Catholic thing and Catholic World Report, are more popular, but they're also shorter, of course.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you for coming on.
It was great to talk to you in person now.
All right. Thanks, guys. How do we end this?
Well, just everybody, please comment, like, subscribe, share this material on your social media, Facebook, Twitter, all that good stuff. And of course, support Dr. Ed here. But again, I'll put the links at the bottom of the description to the YouTube video.
If people want to, this will be on, if people want to sort of watch this, they can go to in Facebook, it'll be there, and it'll say,
oh, well, there'll be a description on Facebook and YouTube.
What I did with Fastigi, there was a thing that said Fastigi, and then I clicked on it, and then I was listening to it.
Yeah, there's already people on Facebook commenting about you. So
yeah.
Good things.
All right. Okay, guys.
Well,
I'm happy to talk about other things, whatever you want. All right. Take care. So if to get out of this, do I go with the top X out, or?
Yeah, we'll end the show and then we'll go through that. So yeah.